continue our study about anxiety, and today's lesson is called Rejoice, and it's taken from Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. And it says very simply, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I will say, rejoice." This is the passage of Scripture that Paul is using leading into a discussion about anxiety. And I guess Paul's prescription for anxiety is to rejoice and then repeat. Rejoice and then repeat. And that seems awfully simple for such a nasty noun like the word anxiety. And I was just thinking that if anybody on this planet had a reason to be anxious, it would have been the Apostle Paul, the person who is writing these words for our learning. He's about 60 years old. Half of his life has now been devoted to Christianity, so he's been a Christian for about 30 years. And there's hardly a seaport on the Mediterranean that he hasn't either visited or knows about. His back, I think, is probably somewhat angular and curved, probably because of the miles that he's been traveling and establishing new churches, and also the beatings that he's been caused to suffer. He's received 39 lashes on 5 different occasions. He has been beaten with rods on 3 others. There are scars that probably spiderweb across his back, almost like veins on the top of your hand or something. He was once left for dead. He has been imprisoned. He has been deserted by friends and co-workers. And he's endured shipwrecks, storms, and starvation. And in fact, at least based upon Galatians chapter 4, verse 15, it gives us the impression that it's entirely possible that Paul at this point in his life was half blind, that he could barely even read the words that he was writing for our edification. And what's more, at the point in time in which he's writing this letter to the church in Philippi, he's in jail. He is now going to be given a trial in Rome, which is where he had requested. And the Roman emperor at this time is Nero. And Nero has made a habit of placating Roman citizens by giving them what they want, and that is the deaths and crucifixions and murders of Christians. And Paul, at this point in time, was the most famous and well-known Christian of his day. So his future, when he's writing these words, is about as gloomy, I think, as his jail cell from which he's writing them. Yet, if you read his words, which is what we're going to be studying over the next several weeks, you'd think that he had just arrived at Sandals in Jamaica. I mean, he's just happy, right? His letter to the Philippians, if you read through the entirety of it, doesn't bear a single word of fear or even complaint. He never shakes his fist at God. Instead, he lifts his thanks to God and calls on his readers to do the same. Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I'll say, rejoice." Paul's prescription for anxiety begins with a call to rejoice. And Paul is now using every verbal tool in his toolbox to try and persuade his readers to the conviction that he wants all of us to have. First, he employs in the Greek what's called the present imperative, so that the people during that time who were familiar with Greek would read Paul's encouragement to say to rejoice continually and habitually, like always. And if the verb tense that he used wasn't enough, then he removes the expiration date from the verse, right? Rejoice in the Lord how often? Always. Not just on Mondays, not just on even-numbered days, not just when you're happy, just to rejoice always. And then, if the verb tense and the word always isn't enough, he repeats the command. And again, I will say, rejoice. But how can a person really, truly obey that commandment? To rejoice always. I mean, is it really possible for any person, including yourself, to maintain an uninterrupted spirit of gladness? And the answer is no. But that's not Paul's challenge. We're urged to rejoice in the Lord. This verse, church, is a call, not to a feeling, not to an emotion, but to a decision, a deeply rooted confidence in the fact that God exists, number one, and that He is in control and that He is good. The apostle held firm to this belief. And Paul was in a position in his life to go ahead and let Nero rage on. Let preachers self-promote, because that's what was happening in some of the early churches that Paul had established. Let the storms blow in his life. And the curious thing about Paul is he's a former tent maker. Remember, Paul never wanted to derive any income from the churches to whom he was sharing the good news, and so he had an occupation. And he made tents for a living. And I think in Paul's tent of faith, his life, it would never, ever collapse because he had stabilized his tent with a very sturdy belief system. Have you ever put up a tent before? Some of them are easy. I have one, and it tries to give me instructions on what to do. I don't use it as often as I ought, so I have to refer to the instructions. And I will tell you, it takes me a lot longer to put up my tent than it probably should, but at least it's up. But what I do know is that camping out, let's say in Cuyamaca, where it gets a little cold or it gets a little windy, you want to make sure that you have some really good stabilizers inside the tent. Otherwise, what's going to happen? It's going to blow over. It's going to collapse. It's going to fall. And in Paul's tent of his life, he had some very firm stabilization, these poles within the tent that kept his faith solid. And the question that I was asking myself, and then hence I'll ask you, is Paul's tent was really sturdy. How about your own? I mean, if you were to take your tent and peel back the flaps and take a look, you would see inside your tent, kind of the window into your soul, a series of beliefs that serve like poles to stabilize your tent of life. Your belief system is basically your answer to some of life's very fundamental questions, some of which include, is anyone in control of the universe? Does life really have a purpose? Do I personally have any value within the ambit of the universe within which I live? Is this all there is to life? And the thing is that your belief system, which is unique to you, has nothing to do with your skin color. It has nothing to do with your age. It has nothing to do with your appearance or your talents. Your belief system is not concerned about the exterior of the tent, but with its interior. And it is this set of convictions, all of them largely unseen, upon which your individual faith depends. If your belief system is strong, then your faith is going to stand. If your belief system is weak, then the storms in your life are going to prevail. That's why the Apostle Paul, in each of the letters that he wrote, addressed convictions before he ever addressed actions. If you read through Paul's letters, Paul is constantly getting to what is at the core of your fundamental belief system, your convictions. Because once you understand your convictions, then you can understand the actions from which those convictions lead. So to change the way a person responds to anything in life, you change what a person believes about life. The most important thing for you and me is your belief system. And Paul's belief system, as we know, was Gibraltar strong. If you take a close look at the poles in Paul's tent of life, so to speak, you're going to see one with this inscription: the sovereignty of God. Sovereignty. Sovereignty is the term that the Bible uses to describe God's perfect control and perfect management of the universe. He preserves and governs every element of life. He's continually involved with all created things, directing them to act in a way that fulfills God's divine purpose. And in the treatment of anxiety specifically, a proper understanding of God's sovereignty is absolutely essential. Anxiety is many times, and perhaps more often than not, the consequence of this perception of chaos. Let me try and explain it to you a little bit differently. If we sense that we are victims of some unseen, turbulent, random force in life, we worry, don't we? And when we start worrying, we get anxious. And I will tell you that psychologists verified this fact when they studied the impact of combat on soldiers in World War II. They determined that 60 days of continuous combat would result in ground troops becoming emotionally dead. And I got to thinking, well, that seems somewhat understandable because soldiers are enduring this constant threat of bombs and machine guns and sniper fire. Almost anything could take their life in a moment. And so the anxiety of the ground troops in this study was actually very understandable and really came as no surprise. What came as a surprise to the psychologists that were researching this issue was the comparative calm of fighter pilots. That came as a shock to the researchers because the pilots' mortality rate was among the highest in combat. Approximately 50% of aviators were killed in action. And yet, when they interviewed these aviators, they loved the work that they did. Fully 93% of them claimed that they were very happy with their assignments, even though the odds of their survival were nothing more than a toss of a coin. Now, how could that be? Why would aviators, who have a higher mortality rate than, let's say, foot soldiers, be happy in their assignment even though the chances of them losing their life are greater than being in combat on the ground? What the researchers concluded was that the aviators had a greater happiness with their life because their hand was on the stick. They were in the cockpit. They were flying the plane. They felt at least they had some control over the fate of their life because they were in control of the weapon that they were piloting. Infantrymen, by contrast, could just as easily be killed standing still or running away. They felt forlorn and helpless. So the psychologists then confirmed this kind of hypothetical, this theory, this formula, that if we have a perception of control, then we tend to be more calm in our soul. It gives rise to this calmness, whereas if we don't have any control, it gives rise to fear and anxiety. This is a picture of ABC 10 talking about traffic delays increasing on local roadways. And the reason why I mention that picture is you do not need to have a World War II study to understand the formula, because road congestion will prove the same thing. A team of German researchers found that a traffic jam triples your chances of having a heart attack. Did you know that? Being in a traffic jam triples your chances of a heart attack. And I got to thinking about that, and I guess that makes sense, because gridlock is the ultimate loss of control, isn't it? I mean, we may know how to drive our car, but the guy next to us, a jerk, he didn't know how to drive. Or we could be a NASCAR champion and know exactly how to maneuver our car in and out of traffic, accelerate, decelerate. But did you know that a texting teenager could be my entire undoing, despite the fact that I might have NASCAR-type skills? There is no predictability in a traffic jam. It's just stress. And anxiety increases as perceived control diminishes. Okay, so then what do? Control everything? I mean, is that the solution? Never board a plane without a parachute? Never enter a restaurant without bringing your own utensils? Never leave the house without a gas mask? Never give away your heart because you're afraid you'll get a broken one? Never step on a crack lest you break your mother's back. Remember that? Face anxiety by taking control? If only we could. The problem is that certainty or control is a very cruel imposter. A person can accumulate billions of dollars in their lifetime and lose it all in a recession. Or a health fanatic can eat nothing but fruits and nuts all of his or her life. Do you remember Yule Gibbons? Do you remember him? That was the grape nuts guy. And Yule Gibbons was famous for just having this really healthy lifestyle. Exercised, ate grape nuts, had basically fruit and nuts in his entire diet, and he died of a heart attack. Remember the guy that wrote The 3-Minute Manager? He made millions writing this book, and he had a very healthy lifestyle because he kind of extolled that in his book. And this guy ran marathons, and he collapsed of a heart attack. So, I mean, you can have this really healthy lifestyle, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're still going to be immune to cancer or even death. A hermit could avoid human contact altogether, but that doesn't mean that they will necessarily avoid having insomnia. We want certainty in life, don't we? But the only certainty we have is that certainty isn't certain. That's why the most stressed out people in the world are control freaks. They fail at the very thing that they pursue the most. The more they try to control the world, the more they realize they can't. And life just then becomes this cycle of anxiety and failure, anxiety and failure, anxiety and then failure. And the truth is, we can't take control because control is not ours to take. That's why the Bible has a far better answer than concluding that we all need to take control of every aspect of our life. The Bible's answer is, rather than seeking total control, maybe the solution is relinquishing the very control that we seek. Because the truth is, church, you can't run the world. But God can. This is the message behind Paul's admonition to rejoice in the Lord. Peace is within our reach, not because of a lack of problems in our life, but because of the presence of a sovereign God who is in control. To read Paul is to read the words of a man who, at his innermost core of who he was as a person, believed in the very steady hand of a loving and good God. Let me give you an example. Suppose your dad is a world-renowned orthopedic surgeon, and people travel from all over the world to come see your father so that he can replace joints and all sorts of orthopedic skills that he can apply to improve their life. He routinely exchanges damaged joints for healthy ones. I mean, with the same confidence that a mechanic might change a spark plug, your dad removes and replaces hips and ankles and elbows and shoulders. And let's assume further, you're 10 years old. And at 10 years of age, you're maybe just a little too young to comprehend the accomplishments of a renowned, worldwide known surgeon. But you're not too young to stumble down the stairs and twist your ankle. So you've now rolled down the stairs, you've twisted your ankle, you're rolling in pain, you're writhing in pain, and you're just weeks away from your first school dance. And you can't show up at the dance on crutches. You need a healthy ankle. And right now, the one that you're looking at is anything but healthy. Then, into the room walks your dad. He still has his scrubs on. He removes your shoe. He peels down the sock and examines the injury. And in your little 10-year-old mind, you groan at the sight of this tennis ball-sized lump on your ankle. And then all of a sudden, your 10-year-old adolescent anxiety kicks in. Oh, Dad, I'll never walk again. Yes, son, you will. No one can help me. Well, son, I can. No one knows what to do. Son, I do. No, you don't. And then your dad lifts his head and asks you a question. Do you know what I do for a living? And actually, you don't. So, you know your dad goes to the hospital every day. You know that people call him doctor. Your mom thinks he's a pretty smart guy. But you really don't know what your father does. So, he says, as he places a bag of ice on your ankle, it's time, son, for you to learn. So the next day, he's waiting for you in the parking lot after class is finished and takes you to the hospital. Hop in, son. I want you to see what I do, he tells you. So he drives you to the hospital office and shows you this constellation. Adjacent to them is a collection of awards that include words like distinguished and honorable. And then he hands you this manual that's this thick that talks about orthopedic surgery that bears your dad's name on the book. And you look at him and he said, "You wrote this?" "I did," he says. Then his cell phone rings. And after the call, he announces, "Hey, gotta go. We're off to surgery." And you then are able to follow your dad. And you scrub up with him. And you walk into the operating room on your crutches. And during the next few minutes, you have a ringside seat to a procedure in which your father is reconstructing an ankle. He's the commandant of the operating room. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't seek advice. Just like Nike, he just does it. And one of the nurses whispers to you, "Your dad is just the greatest." And as the two of you ride home that evening, you look at your dad, and now you see him in a different light. If he can perform orthopedic surgery on a total stranger, he can likely treat a swollen ankle. So you ask him, "Dad, do you think that I'll really be okay for the dance?" "Yes, son, you'll be fine." And this time, you believe him. Your anxiety decreases as your understanding of your Father increases. You see, our biggest fears in life are like sprained ankles to God. And a lot of people, I think, live with unnecessary anxiety over what really is a temporary limp. The next time you fear the future, rejoice in the Lord's sovereignty. Rejoice in what your God has accomplished. Rejoice that he is able to do what you can't. Fill your mind with thoughts of God. For instance, Romans chapter 1, verse 25. He is the Creator who is blessed forever. Or in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Or the psalmist in Psalms 102, verse 27 said, his years will never end. You see, church, God is the King. He is the supreme ruler. He is the absolute monarch. He is the overlord of all history. An arch of his eyebrow could send 1,000,000 angels saluting after him to do his bidding. Every throne is a footstool to God's throne. Every crown is papier mache to his own. He consults no advisors. He needs no Congress. He reports to no one. God is in charge, and we can rejoice in that sovereignty. And so, in conclusion, I think what Paul is trying to suggest to us is as follows. Sovereignty and the understanding of God being a sovereign God kind of gives the saints inside track to peace. Because while others see the problems of the world and wring their hands in anxiety and worry, we see the problems of the world and bend our knees to the sovereignty of our Creator. And so when Paul says to rejoice in the Lord, always, and again, I say, rejoice in the Lord, Paul is not calling us to an emotion. He is not expecting us as Christians to have a constant smile on our face, levitating 2 feet off the ground, and just happy and blissful despite everything that's going on. That's not what Paul is saying. He's saying that you can rejoice and you can eliminate a lot of the stress and the anxiety because your confidence is in the Lord, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's what Paul is trying to get to. It's not a call to an emotion. It's a call to a decision. And so today, I'm going to give you that challenge. What decision are you going to make in connection with the things that cause anxiety in your life? Are you going to choose to just stew about it? Wring your hands with worry and anxiety? It's like, oh, I don't know what to do, and crawl under a rock or hide, or get totally looped or go on a high, just mask everything with drugs or alcohol or pornography? How are you going to deal with anxiety? God is quite clear. He sends the rain on the just and the unjust, right? He sends the sun on the good people and the bad people. So in life, anxious moments are going to come about. The question is, how are you going to deal with it? And if the decision is to rejoice in the fact that we love and live with a God who is sovereign, who is in control of everything, it tends to eliminate a lot of the anxious moments that we have in our life because we no longer have to worry about it. Yes, we need to stay connected in this life. Yes, we need to stay connected with the people with whom we come into contact. This is not a call for us to move to a convent or a monastery and just get in touch with God and be completely isolated from the world. Jesus said that you are a light set on a hill, that you're to be salt, to give life a savor and a flavor and a preservative quality. So God never called us to distance ourselves from problems and people. What He called us to do is to get rid as best we can of the anxiety-producing events in our life by choosing to decide to follow a sovereign God. And that's a choice that you can make. It's not an emotion you try and get yourself into. It's a conscious choice that today I'm going to deal with my anxiety by understanding that I serve a sovereign God who is in control of everything. And I may not understand everything that's going on, but I do understand this, that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that God sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to die for my sins so that someday I can live with Him eternally. Because God can't put up with sin, and I am. I'm a sinner. That's what Paul said. All have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, right? So if all of us have sinned and God cannot deal with sinners, God's going to be in heaven alone with His angels in Jesus. But He wants a family. And so He gave His Son as an atoning sacrifice so that through Jesus' sacrifice, despite living a perfect life, He's given the punishment that I deserve because I live an imperfect and sinful life. So God exchanged my sin for His salvation by providing me an avenue through which I can make that connection. That's Jesus. So when you come into anxious moments in life, it's not so much to wring your hands and worry and anxiety, but instead to make a choice to follow a God that loves you so much that He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to die for you so that through Him you would never, ever perish, but always have eternal life. I appreciate what Curtis said this morning before the prayer and encouraging you to come to the class that Steve is presently teaching, that we live in the kingdom now. Yes, we're looking toward heaven, but the kingdom of God is here. This is Christ's body, His church. This is part of the kingdom, and we're living in that kingdom now. And so to the extent that God is encouraging you to live in this kingdom, He wants to allow you to follow a sovereign God and alleviate your anxiety to the best that you'll allow Him to. And that is believing and choosing to rejoice in the Lord. That's your challenge this week. So we've picked out a song that we're going to sing. If you have any prayer requests, now is the time to send them up. We'll talk about them, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand, please.